Well, Reverend Owens, again, thank you so much for doing this. This is a real honor to be able to interview you for this project. Having read so much about you and heard so much about you over the years, it's really great, an honor. What I wanted to do, as Phil has filled you in, I wanted to start at the beginning with your early life. And you were born in Alabama, born in Birmingham?
Birmingham, Alabama.
Birmingham, Alabama. And when were you born?
1942.
What did your folks do?
My dad worked in a factory, and in 1958, I think it was, my dad was terminated from his job for organizing a union, trying to organize a union at a plant that's still, to this day, still unorganized, Pacifico.
Oh, really?
And for a long time, he had went out and bought a brand new 57 Plymouth. And his boss, who was white at the time when he went back to work, said to him that the union had bought that car for him. And he said, no, I bought this myself. And he was terminated. Him and a white woman was terminated for organizing. The two of them had basically been pushing the steel working, in fact it was at the time. And he really had struggled from that point on. And when I got involved in the civil rights movement, he never really accepted what I did, but my mother, sisters and brothers did. But in 1977, when I went to work for the Amalgamated Clothing Textile Workers in the Industrial Union Department, was the first time that me and my dad really got to be what you so-called brothers and friends, because he was so excited that I was working for a union. He had lost his job some 20 years earlier. It was like 20 years to the date that I went to work for the clothing textile workers. Being involved in 1963, coming from being ran out of Birmingham to Atlanta. And when I came to Atlanta, in the fall of '63, Scripto workers went on strike over here on Jackson Street around the corner from Ebenezer Baptist Church. And Dr. King had gone over to walk the picket line with him, and some of us had went over and joined the picket line. That was my first encounter with any labor and labor activities. Then in 1967, I was sent to Philadelphia to plan for the Poor People's Campaign, and was mobilizing folk to go to Washington for the Poor People's Campaign when we knew of the day of Resurrection City. Dr. King had gotten an invite to Memphis in March, I think it was, of '68, early March, by Reverend H. Ralph Jackson and Bill Lucy and others to come into Memphis. And then going to Memphis, doing something that he hadn't done in the past, doing a march without having us in the town to advance work for him. And we know what took place. A riot broke out, and the rest is history. Eventually was assassinated, but that was really the second encounter that I had with organized labor, and had been seeing people like Cleve Robinson and Bill Lucy over the years, and Cleve Robinson had been branded for being radical and a communist, and this whole thing with the auto workers, and he ended up setting up District 65 up in New York of the auto workers, which was a division of the UAW. But he maintained a relationship with a guy that we hope to honor this year by the name of Walter Russo, who was the president of the auto workers at that time. And what we thought in the movement really sanctioned everything that Cleve Robinson was doing, A. Philip Randolph, Bide Rustin, because I guess most of the African Americans in the trade union movement at that time was seen more so as leaning toward the communist doctrine and philosophy and teaching, but they had no nothing written on them that they was communists and nothing, because they was standing up against the power structure in the trade union movement, then they was basically branded a communist. And I think that happened with Clee Robinson, that happened with Bayard Rustin. They attempted to do that with A. Philip Randolph, but the black church hurriedly corrected them about A. Philip Randolph. I think George Meany had jumped A. Philip Randolph some time ago prior to the March on Washington, telling him, I think it was in '59, that he didn't speak for African American Negroes. And the call went out over the country to black preachers. And AFL was meeting down in Florida. And overnight, I think about 500 black preachers went to Miami where the AFL-CIO was meeting and said to me that he does speak for us. You know, he is our leader, you know. And that whole phenomenon took place that we see today with A. Philip Randolph and how people stand up and respect A. Philip Randolph. But the black church really got behind him and went to the labor movement and said that he was a person who spoke for African Americans, Negroes that we would call at that time.
In those early days in Birmingham, Birmingham had a reputation as a violent city, as a where the races were pretty far apart. There was a lot of discrimination and violence directed towards African Americans. What do you remember about those early days?
Well, to be honest, I didn't know anything about racism or segregation until after Dr. King came to town, because that was the movie theaters. We went upstairs in the balcony, and it was just understood that that's where all the colored folk went. We didn't think about going downstairs, so we just thought it was better upstairs. We went all together. We had the A.G. Gaston Motel, our own motel in Birmingham. We had our own restaurants and our own, playgrounds. And it really wasn't something that fazed us, because we had a good time. On our holidays, we had the best time. When we went to school, we had black schools, they had white schools, and it just didn't faze us until Fred Shuttlesworth took one of his kids and tried to enroll her in Phillips High School. Phillips High School being on the same street as Parker High School. Parker High School was on 8th Avenue. Phillips High School was on 8th Avenue, downtown Birmingham. Parker was on the other end of downtown in Birmingham. And those two schools, when Shuttlesworth took his daughter and attempted to enroll her, who Pat was in school with us, we basically saw violence being perpetrated on Fred Reverend Shuttlesworth and Charles Billups. Then Arthurine Lucy and James Hood went to the University of Alabama and tried to enroll in the university, which was in the 60s. And we saw that type of racism break out. Then when I got involved in the movement, we went to the mass meetings and listened to the speeches and stuff, and then we said, that there is a difference, because we started thinking about, wow, we go to a water fountain and say white only, colored only. We always go to the colored one, and we had been conditioned. But when Dr. King told us that we was somebody, we should be to eat anywhere where we spend our money and drink out in a water fountain, use in the restaurant. Then we started thinking about it, and that's when the consciousness became aware. Because I had went all through childhood, elementary school, high school. In the high school is when it phased us. Sitting on the back of the bus in the early 50s didn't phase us until Rosa Parks sit on the bus in Montgomery, and we started seeing that sign that said colored seat to the rear, right, white seat from the front to the rear. And it was something that never crossed our minds, because we had been conditioned. It's like you're conditioned today not to see racism, not to see segregation, but it's there. It's in folk hearts and stuff. So we was able to live it, and the best feeling was to come out of it. But now it did mess a lot of black businesses up once integration became a law, because those black businesses that we utilized, the cafes and the restaurants and the motels, we was able to go to the Holiday Inn, so we didn't have to go to the A.G. Gaston. So we ran them out of business. We did it ourselves, because we wanted to be so much human to do what other folk did. But we forgot a little black business person in the neighborhoods, cafe, the grocery store, shoe shop, the whole thing, all of those businesses closed up across the country.
Shuttlesworth, you mentioned the integration attempt. I mean, that was, I've read a little bit about that. He was, a mob descended on him when he tried to integrate, register his kids for school. And there was also an attempted bus boycott in Birmingham.
No, it was a successful bus boycott.
Okay.
The bus boycott, see, history has really made a disservice to other movements because they only recorded Montgomery bus boycott. And there was Montgomery bus boycott in Montgomery, Rosa Parks, Ralph Abernathy, Dr. King. They deserved what the notoriety. But that was a boycott in Birmingham, a boycott in Tallahassee, a boycott going on even here in Atlanta at the same time to integrate those buses. But Atlanta was smart. Ivan Allen was able to get together with the preachers in the community and sort of work a lot of this stuff out so that wasn't the same kind of tensions in Atlanta that was in Birmingham or that was in Tallahassee or that was in Jacksonville or that was in Montgomery. We heard about Montgomery basically because of the eloquence of Martin Luther King Jr. We didn't hear about Fred Shuttlesworth, or we didn't hear about the C.K. Steels. We didn't hear about the Joe Lowrys down in Mobile, Alabama. But that was boycotts, movements that was going on strategically across the South. At the same time that the Montgomery bus boycott was going on. I was in high school, and we walked from North Birmingham to Southside, to Smithfield, to Park High School, and enjoyed it. There was no tensions, there was no feuding amongst us. We all were happy, and we all got on the same track walking. If you didn't have a vehicle, or a bicycle, or a motorcycle, you walked. And you were proud to do it. But when we went back to riding the buses, we went back to riding and sitting anywhere we wanted to sit.
So at a very early age, you were involved in these civil rights demonstrations?
But I didn't know it was civil rights at the time. We didn't call it civil rights. We just called it being able to sit anywhere on the bus that you wanted to sit. You're talking 1957, 58. Here I am in high school, playing football on a high school team. Nothing but black folk, always white police that worked the crowd, but they always found black security guards to help them work the crowd, who really controlled the crowd. But the police was the one making the big dollars, and they were probably paying some of the security guards that were out there working. That the big change that came in my neighborhood was one day when the police, and this was like in 1962, I want to say, it was before the height of the movement in Birmingham. And I was standing on the corner, and every time the police pull up on the corner in our neighborhood, everybody run. This one particular evening, the police pulled up on the corner. About 8 or 10 of us standing there on the corner. And he pulled up, and I said, "Don't y'all move. Don't nobody move. Let's just stand here. We ain't did nothing. We ain't got no business. This is our neighborhood." And didn't nobody run. And when the police rolled his window down and said to us, "Y'all think y'all need to be getting off this corner?" We said, what law are we breaking? Why should we leave off the corner? I mean, and we just deveined him and broke him down, and he ended up leaving. And I guess from that point on in North Birmingham, kids stopped running when the police showed up. We found out that we had been believing that we was afraid of the police, but we found out that the police was afraid of us. And that basically stood up first in us. Even during the movement, when the police would do the fire hoses and the billy clubs and the horses and dogs and stuff, they would always attack women first. They very, very seldom would they attack a black male unless he was single by himself. If it was a crowd of us, they would always go to there was a minimum number of African American men. They were basically afraid of black men. That's why you find so many African American men being incarcerated today. And that's the whole mentality of the whole Dixie and the whole Southern. It really has a trend that has spread across this country. That if you get them off the streets and incarcerate them, and they basically turn prison now into a business. So, I mean, it's more profitable to keep somebody in jail than it is to put them in school. And that whole trend really is a trend that has been here to sort of say, if you take his manhood away from him, then you got control of him. And I think we changed that for a minute in Birmingham. And it worked real good for us.
The demonstrations in '63, you were a part of those demonstrations in the spring?
My role was to turn out the schools. The adults had been picketing with Reverend Shuttlesworth, and in their picketing, the business folk who own the mortgages to their homes, who own the liens on their vehicles, will see them on the news in the evening or see their picture in the newspaper, and then they will go and foreclose. Then they will go and repossess their automobile. Then they go to work. They would lose their, they lose their jobs. So when Bevel and some more of the SLC people saw what was happening with the adults, they said, we gotta have to change the strategy here. So what if we get some little kids and young folks and put them in the streets, and what they gonna do with them? And they had no idea that it would turn into the mushroom that it did when we did it. So the first time we had the Parker students, it really was a test to see what happened. But then it took over from the strategists of the movement, the Bevels and the Youngs, because when Parker students got arrested first, Miles College kids was already out there, and then Daniel Payne kids started showing up. And Birmingham was a competitive city, and that whole competition thing stayed in folks' minds. So when the kids at Ormond found out that Parker kids had went out and got in the movement and got arrested for civil rights, they showed up. We didn't even have to go to Ormond. But then you had guys like Cheryl Marcus and Joe Pope who went to Ormond and told some of their kids, just like I went over to Parker and told some of our fellow kids who we had left in school, hey, look, y'all come on out here and get involved in civil rights. Come on out here and protest and march. Have a good time. We had no idea that it would reach the magnitude that it did. But what ended up happening was when we did the Parker students, the Ormond students, the Fairfield students, the Western Olin students, the Dunbar students, the Carver students, the Booker White, it was out of the hands of the leadership because then the people was involved and they had basically taken over. And that was nothing for them to do but to participate in our music, sing our song. And they ended up singing our song, and we sort of changed the trend. And that trend that we changed ended up setting the course for what happened in Birmingham.
How did you get involved in that? How did you, what were you doing?
I went to a mass meeting one night. I was raised in a holiness church. And in Triumph Church, Kingdom of God in Christ, we couldn't coat. Just a traditional thing in our church that we couldn't coat. So one of the young ladies in the choir was the one who went to our church out in Powderly. And I had been sweet on her, and she had been sweet on me. So I don't even remember how we got hooked up to decide to meet at the mass meeting. But she told me that she'd be singing tonight, so we could go out and get a Coke after the church, after the mass meeting was over. And when I went in 16th Street Baptist Church, the first pew across the front was empty. Every other seat in the church, up in the balcony and downstairs, was full. When I went into church, I had no idea what the front pew was. So I just went out to the front to the seat. Little did I know that was the mourner's bench to get you ready to go to jail the next day. So by midway the service, they kept making mention to this young man have come up and got on the bench. He's ready to go. Whoever's coming in, folks ready to start coming sitting up there. So at the end of Dr. King's speech, Ralph Abernathy really got me when he got up talking to the doohickey, telling Bull, come on, you ain't got it. That got me. I never seen anybody talk back to white folk like that. But at the end of We Shall Overcome, they urged everybody off the front pew downstairs. And Jim Bevel ran us through a nonviolent workshop. How to fall, how to take a hit, how to do this and how to do that, and just talk to us about citizenship education. And that's how I got involved. I ain't seen Nala Jean to this day. I mean, you talking early 1963. And from that time to this time, I want to say it was in like middle January. So you're talking, what, 40 years ago. Mm-hmm. So that's how I really got involved from that night, because the next morning, I was told to lead the demonstration at Atlantic Mills. And Bevel had told us about picketing, but he didn't tell us how or where to picket. So I had 10 people with me, and they dropped us off in a van and took us down to Atlantic Mills. I didn't know that you're supposed to picket on the sidewalk. I took my 10 people on the inside of the store and walked all through the store holding up our sign. The store was empty, wasn't anybody in there because, black folk was boycotting. Mm-hmm. Anyway, but I got arrested in the store. And it was like the joke of the movement for about 10 years that I didn't know where to picket. So that was my involvement.
I guess that was the first time you had been arrested?
That was the first time I got arrested.
And by a white police officer?
Oh yeah, there was no black police officer.
So what was that like?
Well, the mistake I made was wearing a suit and tie. I was the only somebody that they had on a suit and tie that led the demonstration. I thought I was going to some business function, and I got up, took my shirt and tie and suit, put it on, and went out to lead the march. And I think I stayed in jail for 5 days. I got out of jail, and there was another demonstration. I got out of jail in the middle of the morning, and there was another demonstration going on from 16th Street Baptist Church. And I just got in it, got locked back up, didn't even go home. I think I stayed in there another 5-10 days. But I got arrested 3 times before I went home. As soon as I got out, I basically went back, because every time you go down in the hype of the moment, you got involved. And then the next jailing was when I turned out to schools in Fairfield. And they had told us, I drove Beverly and Diane Nash's car out to Fairfield. It was like a 59 or 60 Rambler. And I'd driven it out to Fairfield to go to this school and talk to these kids about getting involved. And little did I know that the whole school would walk off the campus behind me. And they got on the car, and we driving down the street going through Fairfield. And Fairfield was where the big steel mill was for Birmingham. And the Fairfield police came out and stopped the march. And they saw me driving, and they arrested me, and the kids went on downtown. And they kept me separated in Fairfield for about 6 days.
Really?
Didn't know what was going on, couldn't get in the newspaper or anything. And they finally got me out of jail. And when I came out of jail, I was like a hero, because then the movement was really tight. Everybody was in jail and stuff was going. So I ended up going in with, them doing workshops and stuff on the inside. And I became a professional jailbird from that point. Every time there was a protest, and 10 hours.
In that spring, what you mentioned earlier that the people were sort of in charge. At some point, it became a people's movement, maybe out of the control of the leadership.
No, Dr. King and Fred Shellerworth stayed in charge, but the people gave them their directions. And when I read Mahatma Gandhi book, and it talked about, there go my people, for I must catch up with them, I am their leader. The folk had given the leaders directions, and the leaders ended up, getting in line with where the folk were, and what the folk was thinking about doing.
What do you think was the key to that success? Or let me just say, did you think it was a success in the spring of '63? In the end,
well, it was more than a success, because before they started the planning for the March on Washington in Birmingham, I know they was on the drawing boards, in Washington. We had been dispatched to the communities around Birmingham. So Birmingham was a vastly populated black neighborhoods all over, all metro Jefferson County. And I was sent to a place called Powderly. Powderly is one of the little communities that sits right outside of Birmingham, over by Ensbury, off from Fairfield, off from Winona, Bessemer, all of that in the same area. And my thing was to go out to Powderly and conduct a voter registration drive. And we went in the neighborhood and set up citizenship education, teaching people how to read, because there was a lot of literacy. Folk had homes, but they couldn't read and write. But there was a lot of educated folk who had gone to college, who had not education, who was able to get their involvement and utilize them. And when we set up the citizenship education in Powderland, we were able to grasp people who had these degrees to help us teach folk. And at first it was a thing that people didn't want folk to know that they couldn't read and write. But then once the illiteracy question got exposed, like how many bubbles is there in a bar of soap? You know, somebody with a PhD degree didn't know.
Right.
You know, what is the 16th word in the Constitution of the United States? I mean, there was questions on the literacy test that you took to become a registered voter, even intimidated those with college degrees, because that was lawyers and principals and all of these high professionals with PhDs that didn't have college degrees, that had college degrees, they weren't registered to vote. So those folks ended up getting into the citizenship program and helping us under Miss Clark and Arthur Cotton and Andy Young's auspices. The whole idea was to train folk and help them through that test. Then SCLC made a mistake, and they sent me to Texas to hook up with Cesar Chavez. They was doing a march across Texas, and the Texas Coalition, which was labor, the church, and the civil rights community, primarily helping the migrant workers and Mexicans. And I got involved in that, and they was doing a voter registration guide. Don't forget the guy named Larry. Larry, he went up to the University of North Carolina and taught. What was Larry's last name? Out of Austin, Texas, man. Larry Goodman. Larry Goodman was a white professor at Houston Tillerson College at that time. But Larry ended up being closely contacted with Andy Young and Dr. King. And so when we went into Texas, Larry became our host. And he basically got me, Liz, Marcy, and myself, and we toured Texas with the marchers, with the migrant marchers, Cesar Chavez and them. Started to sing freedom songs like we did in Birmingham. And he recorded an album, the first album that we recorded. Larry recorded it. And that was that first connection with the postcard that they was using in Texas, because we was using the literacy test in Alabama and Mississippi and Georgia. But in Texas, you only had to fill out a postcard and mail it. And that's when we really got to talking about how do we make Alabama and Mississippi and Georgia just like Texas. But see, you had people in Texas, like the Bushes that we know of today, but you had the Senator Ralph Yarborough. You know, the Yarboroughs was basically liberal folk, and they had a lot of liberal thinking. And we was able to hook up with some of them through the Texas Coalition, which was more driven by labor than it was by anything. Mm-hmm. And we saw a lot of good stuff.
Mm-hmm. The other thing I wanted to ask about Birmingham was the bombings that occurred. There was the famous bombing, the one that was so devastating, the 16th Street Baptist Church that killed the 4 little girls. But there were so many others too, something like 50.
That was a bomb every night during the spring and summer of 1963 that went off in that city. Mm-hmm. Never will forget this one night that they had planned a bomb at the A.G. Gaston Motel. Bomb went off at the motel, which was a little bomb. And see, what would happen is every time a bomb would go off, the crowd would just show up in the streets around it. But this particular bomb, they had went up on a telegram post and put another bomb with all kind of metal and pigs and stuff in it that really was supposed to hurt a lot of folks. And when this first bomb went off, the temperature in Birmingham just drastically dropped down to like about 15 degrees. And it was too cold for anybody to run to the streets. But when the first bomb went off, the only somebody who ran to the street was the fire department and the police. When the second bomb went off, only somebody got hurt was the firemen and the police officers. And that turned the Justice Department really, and Bull Connor, into putting harness on a lot of the bombing that had taken place over on Dynamite Hill, which was out in the Smithfield area. And they still call it Dynamite Hill today. Mm-hmm. But that was a bomb that went off every day. My church, Triumph Church, was bombed. My granddad had built that church, from the ground, and And when they bombed Triumph, it really dawned on folk that little churches like Triumph that wasn't involved in the movement was not immune. And that means churches basically, all of the churches didn't get involved and follow King. But churches like, little churches like Triumph pretty much got involved and started doing some of the same things.
Mm-hmm. So a bomb every night.
Yeah.
What were your impressions of Reverend Shuttlesworth?
I thought we had the greatest leader in Fred Shuttlesworth. When we thought that Fred was really invincible was the night that his house was bombed. And someone had gotten into his house and placed a bomb behind the head of his bed. And we had Colonel Stonewall Johnson and all the rest of them doing security at his house. Wouldn't allow people to come up around the house after a certain hour. And this one night, his house was bombed. And when Colonel Johnson and them went into the house, he was still in the bed. They thought he was dead, but he was still in the bed asleep. And they bombed and knocked down the walls and everything, and nothing happened to him. And I think that's when people said that he was a saint. You know, that spread it throughout. You know, we did a lot of exaggeration. You know, around the whole thing while the bomb was in his house and his sheets didn't get no dirt on them. We added a lot to it, but I think that was one time that we really knew that the Lord was in the middle of that movement and was protecting him, and we protected everything that was about him, and tried our best to keep the movement going to get a lot of stuff off of him, and we, I think, was successful.
And what about Dr. King? What was your?
Now, I didn't get to know Dr. King like I did Reverend Abernathy and Reverend Bevel and Andy Young and Dorothy Cotton, because when I heard Ralph Abernathy speak first night at this church, that's who I looked up to. I mean, I thought Dr. King was so eloquent. I mean, I was so caught up with what Ralph had said when he got up that I really didn't hear Dr. King when he got up to speak. And from that point, I started following Ralph. And then in about, it was after the March on Washington in '63, we had a meeting over here in Atlanta for something, and I was pretty much close, sitting by Dr. King, and we basically, I think, was asking me for a cigarette. I don't forget what it was. But we started talking. That was the first time I'd ever had a conversation with him. I had many conversations with his brother. But I think that conversation led to a friendship that I still have with him today. When I feel that I need to talk to somebody, then nobody saying something good, I talk to Dr. King. But I want to say it was in October of '63. It's really when I got to start knowing him and talking with him and communicating with him. I scared him one day. We was in Chicago in 1965. We had went up there for the riots. We'd been there. He pulled me and some more of us in 1964 to go into Philadelphia, Chicago, New Jersey, New York, D.C., where all of the riots were. And he called his riot prevention squad, and me and Big Lester and Willie Bolden, we were basically the ones that he chose. We just happened to be the largest over on his staff. But this one particular night, I had to drive him to the airport in Chicago, and it had been snowing, and I was driving, and he was talking, and he was sitting in the middle on the front seat, and I hit the median going up, the tires rolled over the median, had the little bruise in it. Scared him, and he threw his hand up and said, "Lord, I'm coming home." You know, that was the first time that I said, this man is truly coming from God and with God, because the first thing that came out of his mouth, he talked to the Lord, and I'm coming home, and threw his hands up in the air. And from that point on, I saw him as being something that I looked up to sacredly, you know, and believed in him up until the assassination.
And you were involved with King's movement, with SCLC through the Poor People's Movement. I mean, even after that.
Well, I stayed with SCLC from the end of 62, early 63, up until 1977. I'm still with them. I'm just, you know, working now where I'm getting a paycheck. But I stayed with them until 77 when I went to work for the clothing and textile workers in the industrial unit department.
After the mid '60s or so, certainly in Memphis, I mean, King seemed to be moving towards more interaction with labor, more directly. You know, that was a labor dispute. You know, want everybody together. Garbage.
But I think it was before the latter part, because if you go back to the late '50s and early '60s, the relationship that he had bridged with Randolph, with Cleveland Robinson, there was a closeness between Dr. King, with Jerry Worth, with Walter Reuther, with these guys who I thought were people who understood after the death of some of them, but understood the whole plight of what our movements were all about and the connection with coalescing. They had a kinship that we didn't know about. When he spoke at the AFL-CIO, CIO convention, AFL-CIO convention in '59, Randolph made that possible. Cleve Robinson supported it. He wasn't ousted from the auto workers at the time. But Walter Reuther, who was the president of the auto workers at the time, was the one that basically opened the door for that. And their connections was there with the bond money that they raised to get folk out of jail. A. Philip Randolph, through one of his members, was the treasurer in the bus boycott in Montgomery. So that was some ties, a lot of ties.
What was it like? What were your remembrances of the Poor People's Movement that was going on towards the end when King got involved with this?
Well, the Poor People's Campaign, he didn't make it to Washington with us because he got assassinated. While we was in Washington, Bobby Kennedy was assassinated. But I think planning the Poor People's Campaign and seeing the different groups that he had pulled together, poor whites, Mexicans, Indians, Native Americans, Cubans. I mean, he was pulling together folk who was pushed out and the set asides in this country that nobody else had thought about reaching out to. Because they had said that we was getting all of the welfare in this country. What little welfare there was, but when they looked at the rolls, white folk was getting 20 times more welfare than we were. And I think when he said, okay, let's go out and strengthen it. So they think it's us. Let's show them it's not just us, but it's everybody. And he was able to bring blacks and whites and brown, together in D.C. And it really opened some eyes that had never really been opened before with his whole Poor People's Campaign.
And it was they had a whole city they did set up there in Washington.
Yeah, Resurrection City. I was the sheriff of Resurrection City. Nobody else wanted to be the peacekeeper. So I was appointed the sheriff of Resurrection City. Everybody wanted to be the mayor. Jose wanted to be the mayor. Jesse Jackson wanted to be the mayor. Ben Clark wanted to be the city manager, or Stoney Cooks. But I told him, I said, all right, I'll be the peacekeeper. So it was my job to keep peace in the city. One of those commandos from Detroit, Michigan had come in, and we had brought in Blackstone Rangers and Vice Lords from Chicago. But this one particular guy had been
doing a lot of cussing and a lot of threatening of folk. So I went around. I said, hey, young man, I said, why don't you straighten up? Cut this out. And he hauled off and hit me in the jaw. And I did this, and some said, no, if you took it from Bull County, you can take it from here. And I stood there and didn't take it. And then when he went off, everybody came up telling me how big I was for not retaliating, and how that took a whole lot. And I'm thinking, man, it took a whole lot, but it hurt. And I left and I followed him, went and talked to him. I said, man, anybody who hit hard as you ought to be one of my peacekeepers. I need you to be out here on my force, helping me keep peace in the city. And convinced him that he could do more working with us, and he ended up being one of my captains. He died about 12, 15 years ago. It was with Ditto from Chicago. He left Chicago and went up to Detroit, where this guy was. And he ended up about 15 years ago, I think it was. But he knocked the devil out of me. And I think I saw stars. But he ended up being one of the best peacekeepers that we had. Before we got out of there, he was one of the folks decided who would go to jail just like I was. And that was our role.
Where were you when you heard that Dr. King had been assassinated?
I was standing in front of him.
Really?
Yeah.
You were there in Memphis?
Yeah.
Oh. What went through your mind, or what are your remembrances of that sort of time?
Well, I was wrestling with Andy Young in Bevel. I flipped Andy over my shoulder, and King came out and leaned over the back and said, "James, you're gonna hurt him." Bow. And I thought it was a firecracker. I really thought somebody was playing a joke. I looked around and I looked over behind the fire station, which is across the street from the Lorraine Motel. Saw this big puff of smoke, and somebody shooting a firecracker over there. And turned back around, looked up, and I saw his feet hanging out over his back. And I said, wow. Then I went up one set of steps on one side, and then went up another set of steps on the other side. And went up there and saw that he had been shot. But police came. I told them they need to go check the fire station. They never did. 2 years ago, Bill Pepper, who was an attorney that James Earl Ray retained to work with him, we went and met with Ray and told Ray, and we didn't think he did it. But Bill Pepper reintroduced a lot of stuff that was left out. 1968, when Dr. King was assassinated, I never was interviewed by the FBI, by the Justice Department. I basically said this to Pepper. And I said everybody knew I was there, and all of the records showed that I was there. Andy Young, James Barnes, the whole thing. And had more stuff about what took place that day, what went on in the church, what happened after we left the church. And Bill got to going into it, and he discovered that he could get a new trial in Memphis. HBO carried it. It was like a mock trial, but it was that testimony about the fire station, because it came out that the lone African American who was working for the Memphis Police Department, who had been in that fire station, was mysteriously asked to leave. And all of the blacks, the cooks and everything that was there, was asked to leave the fire station. And then one of the whites who was over there basically said that the government was involved, and that the shot had come from the fire station.
This reopened. This was Ray. Ray retained a lawyer, and there was a case. This whole. I guess.
No, the case came out. They said that it was a conspiracy,
mm-hmm.
and they never did vindicate Ray, but they did end up saying that the government did end up saying that it was a conspiracy. So that's what came out of that hearing that took place. One of the judges who said that it was more than one weapon has a TV show now, who was the judge in Memphis that got the case. Big judge. Come on, Judge TV, not That's the one from Chicago. But the other one, he was the one ruled that it was more than one weapon involved. I said Judge Brown. I think that's his name. But he was a judge there in Memphis that just got off the bench, got on the TV judging that.
What do you remember about, what stands out in your mind about King's final days? I mean, there was a lot of rallies connected to this strike that was going on. What do you remember about
What I mostly remember is the intenseness that he gave in communicating with us, that we really realized that he was preaching his own funeral that last few months prior to the assassination, with the references that he made about, when I died, I don't want a long funeral, just tell him I was a drum major for justice and peace, a drum major for peace. And it didn't dawn on us, but he was really preaching it. And I guess the night before the assassination, when he did the mountaintop speech, that sort of was the clearest indication for us that he knew that his days was numbered, that wouldn't be that long. And the harassment that he was taking from the FBI, it was just, I mean, you could see it, man. The joy and stuff just left because he was dealing with the humiliation coming from J. Edgar Hoover and others.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the threats and they were really after him.
Mm-hmm.
The other, before I want to talk about labor a little bit, but the other thing that I need to ask you about is also Selma. We were talking a little bit about Selma, I think, before I got the tape rolling. Mm-hmm. You were involved in the action at Selma, the march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge.
Well, I actually took the first group into Selma. Bernard Lafayette and SNCC had a team that had been working in Selma since 1963. Mm-hmm. But on December the 26th, 1964, Bevel dispatched me to Selma. I found out sometime later that he was afraid to go. So he had me in Montgomery working on integrating Montgomery and doing civic participation for registration. And he sent us to Miss Amelia Boynton's house. Amelia Boynton was one of the leaders in the Dallas County Voters League, who lived at that time on the corner of Lapsley and Small Street in Selma. And then we got to Lapsley and Small Street, and I got out the van with about 6 people and knocked on her door, and I saw the curtain open, but she didn't open the door. So we stood out there and knocked, and we saw the car in the back, but she went over the door. So we went across the street on the corner and started, just gathering and started singing freedom songs. The people in the neighborhood started coming out. But what we didn't know was that there was an injunction in Selma that no more than 2 black folk could get in the streets together at the same time. And we ain't know nothing about no injunction. I mean, didn't know how to pronounce it. So we started singing. And the next thing we know, 400 or 500 people will come on the streets with us and start singing freedom song. And the police show up and left. And that basically broke that injunction in Selma that had African Americans living under since 1963, the end of 63, after the Birmingham bombing, church bombing. And it was just like one of those things for us to go to Selma on the 26th of December, the day after Christmas, with Lula Williams, Leon Hall, Priscilla Howard, Barbara Howard, and sing a freedom song. And about 5 or 6 days later, Martin Luther King would show up. We thought for one church, but he ended up packing 4 churches, and the rest is history.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Were you there when the march across the bridge?
Yeah.
When the troopers attacked.
But Andy Young, Stoney Cooks, and myself, it was chosen that 2 people from SCLC and 2 people from SNCC would lead the march across from Brown's Chapel, across the bridge. And we didn't know what was going to take place. So the 2 folks from SCLC was Jose Williams and Albert Turner. The 2 from SNCC was John Lewis and Bob Mance. Then everybody else fell behind him. So what Andy did was had us to go up to the bridge on Water Street and at the Broad Street and parked. And we got there and parked. And while we were parking, the last of the marchers was making a turn, going. Jose and them had gotten across the bridge, and we just heard all this pop, 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 and it was tear gas. And then we saw these horses coming back, and then we saw people running back, and they started beating people back across the bridge. Then we got out. I said, Andy, you need to leave. You need to go on back to the church. Let us handle it from here. So Stoney finally convinced Andy that he shouldn't be caught down there, because we knew that if they saw him, they was going to probably do something to him. And we started gathering folk, getting them off the middle of the bridge, bringing them back to Ace Anderson's ambulances, and piling them in, and he was taking them, where they can get some help down to Good Samaritan Hospital.
Did people have any indication that this was going to happen?
Nobody knew anything. When Major Cloud said that you have, I think we want to say 5 seconds to this person, 3 seconds to this person, they charged somebody to finish the statement. They started beating them back across the bridge. Tear gas, the whole thing.
And Selma's usually credited as sort of a big turning point with regards to the Voting Rights Act.
It was
and all that.
It was the political empowerment, because that was teachers in Selma that couldn't register. And Selma was something like about 65% African American. Dallas County was, and all of those black belt counties down in the black belt of Alabama. They were basically predominantly 80%, 85% black counties, and that's where we said we were going to have to do a battleground and getting people registered to vote. Today, all of those counties are controlled by African Americans. Had not been for that movement of the 60s, Viola Leusa getting killed, Jimmy Lee Jackson dying, had all that not taken place, we probably would have saw something different.
And then there was the march to Montgomery, Sunday Montgomery march.
Well, the second march that we took from Brown's Chapel to see if the state troopers was going to let us march, they was there, but then the Justice Department had came in and federalized the troops, the National Guard, and the National Guard basically got with us and said that they would escort us to Montgomery, but once the troops opened, the state troopers opened, we marched a few blocks and then turned around. Dr. King said, we're going to go back to the church and get ourselves ready, like to make this trek from Selma to Montgomery. Now, it angered SNCC folk, because they wanted to go on and march that day, but there was no provisions. There was no housing worked out. There was no food. And we weren't just going to put folk out on the dark road. See, there was no lights on Highway 8 at that time. Now, it's all a few lights out there.
And still, you had people beaten, and I think even at least one person killed, right, in that march.
Well, you had Viola Leusa killed on the way back from the march, but James Reeb and Jonathan Daniels, 2 preachers, white preachers, was also brutally, one in Wilcox County and the other one in Selma, was also brutally beaten at a black restaurant just prior to the march taking off.
So even with the presence of the federal people, it's still really dangerous.
But it was dark when they did it. See, none of this was done in the light. All of this was done where people couldn't see it. When Jonathan Daniels and James Reed got killed, it was like people stole them in the dark. They didn't know it was coming. Viola Leusa was driving down Highway 80 on the way back to Selma from Montgomery, and a car passed and shot her in the car. They didn't stop, pull over, say, my name is this, bow. They just shot her and kept moving. But luckily, it was an informant in the car with them that basically reported what happened. Leroy Moulton is still living today, the guy who was in the car with her.
Yeah, they have an exhibit to her up at Wayne State University.
She was from Michigan.
A student there. Really interesting. One thing I wanted to ask you about also was religion. Religion is a big part of the civil rights movement. You're a minister. How did you get involved with this? Or can you talk about sort of your spiritual side a little bit?
If you was in the movement and you didn't have any tanks, you didn't have any guns, you didn't have any armies or navies, and the only thing you had was prayer. That in itself made you spiritual. I got my calling in 1964 when we was on the anti-riot prevention squad, and the church had always been a major role for us in the movement. I think the process that we try and utilize today in the trade union movement with Labor in the Pulpit, with other coalescing ideas that we attempt to utilize, stems from that involvement during the movement days. Our churches was the sanctuaries that we could utilize and have our mass meetings in, but they would be bombed when we finished. Here we are talking about an archives here at Georgia State University. But in 1963, 40 years ago, a church was bombed with 4 little girls. 40 years ago, Vernon Damon was burned up in his house. 40 years ago, Bull Connor and his dogs. For us to make it 40 years later, we had to have something working with us, because we didn't have the security of an army, but we had the security of God. We had his full armor around us. And I believe that even to today, that if it wasn't for the Lord, I don't know where I'd be. If it wasn't for his spirit continuing to give me strength, I don't know where I'd be. When I do my talks with seminaries and young preachers, I try to instill in them that it's going to have to be the church to take us to the next level, to lead these coalitions that has to take place. Because if the church doesn't lead us, who's going to lead us? Because the church is the only group that's really not bought and controlled. Preachers independent. When we get ordained, or when we get calling from the Lord, we must take that and take it to its fullest. We must read the book, and in John's Gospel, where it says, "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among men." We must make our Word become flesh. We can't just talk about how David picked up a rock and killed Goliath if we won't pick up a picket sign and picket City Hall when it's wrong. So we can't talk about David if we're not going to live like David. We can't talk about the Lord delivering Daniel from the lion's den, and you get out here in the streets and don't believe the Lord will deliver you from Memphis, Tennessee. We can't talk about how he got Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego out of the fiery furnace if you don't think he's going to get you out of Miami, Florida. So the same principles that you preach about, you have to put those principles in your life and in your perspective, and you have to believe what you preach. And if you believe what you preach, everything else is secondary. Because he's still on the throne. He's still telling the sun what time to come up in the morning. He's still telling the stars where it should shine and where it should land, where the eastern star should be. He's still telling the moon whether it should be a quarter, half, or a full moon. He's still in charge. So if I can't do that, or if I don't know nobody who can make that happen, I have to continue to serve him. And I think that's spiritual Christianity that we do in my work is the same thing that I try and instill in folk when I go out. I tell them, leave it in the hand of the Lord.
You know, when I've studied Birmingham's labor movement, I wrote my dissertation on the miners' union in Birmingham and how it got reestablished. And part of it's how it got reestablished in the 30s. What you see over and over again is that the organizers often work through the church, particularly in the African American community. And it's almost like the line between church and union, it doesn't exist. The songs, it comes from the songs that miners sing or that steelworkers sing, that when they had the quartets, you know, they would sing the Last Supper and they would put it as Jesus told the disciples to stay in the union, things like this. It's a very close relationship.
But I think the labor movement has taken the church and the civil rights movement for granted and misused us to a large degree, because that full partnership is not there until they need us.
Mm-hmm.
When they need us, then doors are open. But when they don't need us, you catch them doing a lot of right-wing things, like what happened in Meridian last week. Here, trade unionists have been terminated by Lockheed, and the union went to bat for him and got him his job back. But then the next week he go and walk into a sensitivity meeting with blacks and whites, and he walked in and killed 4 blacks. Didn't kill himself, but he shot other folk. Labor movement didn't know that when they went to bat for him and took his case to arbitration and won that arbitration, that he would go out and do it. But then the same thing could happen right here in Atlanta with Lockheed. The same scenarios are right here at Lockheed in Atlanta, where the black church had to come and get involved with the work. Labor movement has to make true of its principles and what it teaches and what it's thrived at. If you look at when you sit down to negotiate a contract, you negotiate a contract for everybody. I think you have to be with folks when you find that your folk are discriminating against their co-workers, or discriminating against a person because of his background, jumping on a person just because they're Jewish, or jumping on a person because they're gay. We gotta stand up against stuff like that if we truly trade unionists. Because when you find that the boys who gave us the whole idea of this whole trade movement, this trade union movement, they weren't thinking about racism, they weren't thinking about sexism. They was thinking about making sure that you have good working relationship on the job. You was getting a good pay. You was doing this good rest, good vacation, good health benefits, this whole thing. But then, when you got the good old boy syndrome in your system, and you look at a situation like here in Atlanta, 70% of the African Americans who work, that's in the trade union movement, of union members, that Labor Council and the Federation, predominantly force of folk that's in the trade movement here is African American and women. But that's not the way to look at the top. You look at the state fed, you don't see no African American head, and all the officers, you don't see the women. Labor Council, the same scenario. But we don't get out the labor movement. We don't tell folks you need to get out the labor movement because you're not being represented. We try to go there, sit up constituent groups to sort of keep those issues up front and make those things happen. I think the labor movement has to really rethink the policies of the past to sort of change if we're gonna really compete in the future. I was really thinking that John Sweeney, when he became president of the AFL-CIO, was gonna really change something, but he didn't. You know, we got the same, some of the same problems that we had prior to his election. There was a movement of dealing with African Americans, and now that trend is changing, now you see a lot of African American men push back and bringing in Latinos and Asians, and it's bad. And I think it's going to start a trend that's not going to be helpful for the labor movement, because you see in African Americans now talking about getting out the labor movement. When I go into certain meetings and see a lot of these young black people who didn't participate in Birmingham and don't know what Birmingham was all about, these kids are the kids of the folk who participated, and they didn't experience bull cunning. So they don't owe the same thing that their parents owe. And I think they're going to turn right wing and turn against labor, because labor has turned against them. And it's evident that is taking place. But do you stop? No, I think you have to enhance it try to just be that voice in the wilderness, to say to folk that you shouldn't deal with people on an ethnic base. Deal with folk on a human base. Black, white, red, yellow, green, orange, blue, polka dot, irregardless to who it is, you need to deal with them. Because I know that if we're gonna help our Latino brothers, it's gonna take the black brothers who had the jobs and got the experience, who've gone through the struggle, know what struggling is all about, to bring them past some of the things that they're gonna have to, some of the barriers that they're gonna have, we're gonna have to help them over those barriers. But if we got those racist barriers that are there, it's gonna be difficult for some folks. You ain't got 100,000 James Oranges. I might think one way, but then you got 100,000 other folks thinking out that different from me. When I'm not here, who gonna have that human side to make sure that we continue this whole effort of pulling these groups and coalitions together? The face has to change, you know. The sexes has to change because women are a major force in this workforce. All of that stuff ain't good for us unless we go out there and correct it.
This is a very old problem with the labor movement too. I mean, I think from studying Alabama labor, Wallace picked up on this problem and exploited it with white workers in the 60s and 70s. Very successful. The Citizens Councils did too.
But Wallace, Wallace repented, and he basically came back and changed his position and his attitude on race, on workers and workers' rights, and he became probably one of the most greatest proponents of unionization in the state of Alabama. Now, we never got enough in the legislature to change the right to work laws, but when Wallace went through his transitional period of segregation and that whole transition that he went through, Wallace ended up probably being the best governor that the state of Alabama ever had for African Americans and labor. He brought in stuff because he was there to hold stuff back. You had folks like Frank M. Johnson, federal judges, you know, looking over his shoulders and stuff. But this guy, in 1995, when we did the 30th anniversary of March from Selma to Montgomery, Wallace met us at the doorsteps of the St. Jude School in Montgomery and apologized to us what he had did 30 years earlier. He repented. We forgave him. We told him that, look, we forgive him. He sat there and cried and asked us to pray for him. But it wasn't long after that he died. But he did hear from those who he had pressured and held down that they forgave him. When you were able to forgive somebody, forgiveness is, that's powerful. I mean, but it's hard for some people to forgive and forget. You need to forgive and forget, but you don't need to forget that you forgot, because you still need to remember some of the things that supposedly you don't forget.
You started with the union movement full time in the 70s.
1970, February 28th.
Tell me about
1977.
What was how did that happen? How did you go with?
J.P. Stevens' campaign was going on at the time, and Daddy King, Martin Luther King Sr., was very, very close to a guy by the name of Murray Finley. Murray Finley was the president of the Amalgamated Clothing Textile Workers, come out of the clothing union, and had known Dr. King, had known of his works, and had believed a lot of the things that he did. There was a guy by the name of Howard Samuels who worked for the clothing workers that ended up running the industrial unit department, who had worked in a whole lot of this stuff that started in 1963 when the J.P. Stevens organizing campaign first got started. A guy by the name of Paul Swady had talked to Leon Hall, who was working with textile workers and car fairs, and Daddy King said that, look, y'all need to utilize some of our people from the civil rights movement as organizers. Y'all coming to us, telling us that you want us to get black folk to do this and do that. Why don't you just put some of them to work and you'll have them to do it? And Paul came and interviewed me at the Birmingham Hotel down here on Spring Street. And he said that, how would you like to come to work for the FL-CIO for the clothes textile workers? I said, well, I think about it. And I left. I had been working for SCLC. I had did the pilgrimage from New Orleans. We had walked from New Orleans to Washington, D.C., crisscrossing across the South, registered voters, leading up to the election of Jimmy Carter in 1976. And Jimmy Carter had gotten elected, and Andy Young had gone to work for him. And that really wasn't a whole lot to do, so I needed to take care of my family. I've gotten about 3 paychecks in 2 years from SCLC. So Gulf Oil Company gave SCLC $50,000, I think it was at the time. And Ralph Abernathy was thinking about running for Congress. So I went to Ralph and I told him, why don't he lay me off and give me a layoff slip so I can go to the unemployment office and I can get unemployment for 6 months and give me a severance paycheck from some of the money that you got from Gulf Oil. And Ralph agreed to do it. I think he gave me about $600 or $700 and gave me a severance slip. I went out to the unemployment office and I started drawing unemployment. And meanwhile, drawing unemployment, Christmas came around. And my family was in Birmingham with my mom, but I had my house here in Atlanta that we had bought a house in 72, 73, but I maintained the house, paying for it. But I sent my wife and babies over to Birmingham to live with my mama so they can eat every day. And I brought Fred Taylor from SCLC and Frederick Moore, and I told them, I said, look, y'all can stay at the house. I'm gonna go down here in Mississippi and keep on registering folks. And then they said, but this guy wanna hire you from the union. I said, man, I wanna work for the thugs. The union folks are thugs, I can't do that. So Andy Young called and said that why don't you think about it? Because they want you to work in the South. You're not going to New York, you're not going to Detroit, you're gonna work the South. And I ducked Paul end of December, January, and on the 15th of February, 1977, I was coming into a planning meeting. We had gotten through with the Martin Luther King celebrations. Leon Hall had gone to work for the textile workers. And he told me to come over to the office, over to the basement at Miss King's house. He wanted me to get some paperwork. So I went there, and that was Paul Swayman. And I didn't know Paul was going to be there. And Paul said, I'd like for you to show up on the 28th of this month in Millersville, Georgia, at the Holiday Inn. And I said, okay. A week and a half later, I was in Millersville, Georgia. Been there ever since. And I was assigned to the J.P. Stevens organizing campaign for the first 2-3 years. When I went to Millersville, the civil rights movement had been in Millersville, and I had been to Millersville working with Oscar Davis and them. Oscar and them had been bonding us out of jail. And there was J.P. Stevens plant in Millersville. There was one in Dublin, Georgia. There was one in Louisville, Georgia, one in Tifton, Georgia. And we was assigned to organizing those 4 Stevens plants. And in Millersville, Georgia, they wanted me to organize the community and supporting the workers, and I did. And while we was in Millersville, the Concord Fabrics and the J.P. Stevens put some money up with the police department and bugged our hotel rooms. And in bugging our hotel rooms, the word got out. They moved me from Millersville to Great Falls, South Carolina. While in Great Falls, the word came down that they had bugged our hotel rooms, and the union was filing a suit against the companies there in Millersville who put the money up. And we won. So they said that they was gonna set up 6 accounts. Mel Tate, Fred Nye, James Orange, Jacob Little, the Amalgamated Clothing and Textile Workers Union. And those were the 6. So they had 6 accounts set up. And all these companies had to deposit X number of dollars in their account. And it was like up in the millions of dollars that they had to pay. So each time they paid $100,000 to Fred Tate, they had to give $100,000 to James, and they deposited all that money in all these accounts. So it was really growing to be big. And what the union said to J.P. Stevens, or a couple of guys said, well, we're gonna quit so we can get our money. Like Jacob Little and Fred Nye, I think, resigned and went back home. But I stayed on, Mel stayed on, Lewis Washington stayed on, and Lewis went into management, biggest mistake he ever made. They started jerking him around. But they made an agreement in 1979 that if they sign a contract with the J.P. Stevens plants that had been organized, that had won a union vote, Phil probably familiar with this, they would refund the monies that they had in the 6 accounts and drop the suits. And that's how the J.P. Stevens first contract got signed. So they basically agreed to sign contracts with J.P. Stevens workers who had been organized, I think it was in Roanoke Rapids, North Carolina, Wallace, South Carolina. It was about 7 or 8 plants that they had won union elections with, and those companies got organized. And those are only the J.P. Stevens plants that exist today. All the rest of them was shut down.
Right. So some of the plants that was a difficult campaign.
Oh, very difficult,
I mean,
because the campaign started in 1963, and they got their first contract in 1979. People had been killed, maimed, brown lung, and the whole thing. Millions of dollars had been spent. But the bugging of our hotel room, and had they not bugged our hotel room, then we found out about it, they probably wouldn't have a contract today with J.P. Stevens.
And also, when you were talking about the campaign, I couldn't help but think that your civil rights background and community organizing really paid off on that one, because
that helped in both Millersville and in Great Falls. Well, it helps today. That they don't see me as going into a plant organizing workers. They see me going into a city organizing support for the workers that they're talking about organizing. And that's what my role has been since '77. Well, that's really what my role has been since 1968, before I, started working for labor.
You're also involved with the other thing I've seen, read about you being involved with is voter education with labor also.
Participation. I do the nonpartisan side. Those same organizations who we get them registered, like the state chair of the Georgia People's Agenda for Voter Empowerment. The Martin Luther King March Committee, African American Renaissance, are my pits that I think labor should be more closely involved with. When I do the voter registration in Georgia alone, we did in less than a year over 100,000 people, I think it was 116,000 people, that we didn't tell how to vote. We just gave them a report card and told them these are how people stand on the issues. Now, George W. Bush made the White House move to Georgia and moved it out of Washington. That's what defeated Roy Barnes and Max Cleland. Had the White House not moved to Georgia, Roy Barnes and Max Cleland both would have been elected just on the issues of the report card that we passed out from the People's Agenda. Georgia turned out the highest number of African American votes in that cycle than they had in the history of the state. See what I'm saying? But there was more white people turning out in South Georgia than North Georgia than they ever turned out. Right. And that's what knocked off Max Cleland and Roy Barnes. We are now trying to do the People's Agenda in 9 states. There's a meeting that's coming up this weekend in Montgomery on Friday where the governor vetoed legislation pertaining to felons having the right to vote, right to register once they serve their time and pay that fine. So the Black Caucus is calling a demonstration. Jesse Jackson, Dr. Lowry, Judge Mathers, and a few of us going to go over there and support the Black Caucus. But that evening, the 9 states legislatures and black elected officials and civil rights organizations will be coming together at the New South Coalition office to talk about the conference that's going to take place on the 8th and the 9th of August for Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, Kentucky, and Georgia.
Mm.
But we coming together to do voter empowerment, to do civic participation. And these states want to reduplicate the Georgia people's agenda like what we did. They want to reduplicate what the concerned black clergy did and the work that they're doing. So if these states see what we're doing over Georgia, that means that folk are watching us. And we want to go and give them the same thing that we've been doing here and to work those coalitions together.
Mm-hmm. The other place I've seen you involved with this, read about it, is in South Africa. You were involved.
That's the other pick. I was a part of the anti-apartheid era, and we did some stuff with labor and civil rights with the mine workers. That during the time of the 80s, when we was protesting at the South African embassy, the mines was closing up in this country because the government was paying the differences for mine to be shipped from South Africa to the U.S. and it was cheaper to buy coal from South Africa than it was to buy from Virginia. So we got with the mine work to start dealing with places like the Southern Company that owned Georgia Power, and we started to protest it. And after the protest and the sanctions became law in this country, then we got closely associated with the ANC people.
Mm-hmm.
I basically got hooked up with a brother by the name of Safiso Makatini, who was a trade unionist by law. And when Mandela got out of jail, they brought him to Atlanta. And I was on the host committee. And then I brought Winnie Mandela from Atlanta. And then in 1993, they sent me to South Africa for the first time. And I think I made 16 trips. And I am the regional representative for the ANC in the southern region, not of South Africa. And I've been a member of the ANC since 1993, when we first went over. When President Mandela made his statement in reference to George Bush in involvement in Iraq. I was one of the people who got a call from South Africa before he made that statement about what was going to be said, so I wouldn't be blindsided. But I'm a proud member. I go at least 2-3 times a year
To South Africa.
to South Africa. I take a group every year in March to the African Renaissance, and we've turned my Martin Luther King March Committee into the Martin Luther King March African American Renaissance. We've been taking students and hooking up some of the African students in South Africa with some of the students in the Youth League in South Africa. During the 1993 and 94, we were asked by the ANC to come to South Africa and talk about reconciliation and how did we reconcile with George Wallace and Bull Connor. So I was taking Reverend Tim McDonald and Alice Johnson from the Fulton Commission on Children and Youth, and took all of these delegations over to South Africa and talked about reconciliation. And then got to South Africa and discovered something that I really had forgotten, that the philosophy that we picked up from Mahatma Gandhi was started in South Africa. That Gandhi got kicked off of the train in Pietermaritzburg, which is in KwaZulu-Natal. Had he not gotten kicked off the train in Pietermaritzburg, Martin Luther King probably would have picked up the nonviolence philosophy that he utilized up until today, and that we talk about today. So the closeness that I got in South Africa was through my relationship with Dr. King and his relationship and teaching through Mahatma Gandhi. And then I got over there and I discovered something else, that in 1898, John Dubé, Albert Lutuli, and W.E.B. Du Bois had a meeting in London, England. And they talked about collaborating with African Americans and South Africans. And they met again in 1901. And following that meeting in 1901, and I wouldn't have met this information had I not met with Dubis's family in Durban. come to find out that the ANC and the NAACP was started the same year from the collaboration between Dubé, Lutuli, and Du Bois. And that connection, so I took Earl Shinholster, who was killed a few years ago in an automobile wreck, but Earl Shinholster, who was working on the connections with the NAACP and those connections with the ANC, and he was tragically killed and never brought to light. But that kinship and that closeness go back to 1898.
There's a whole, I guess, Atlanta connection with Du Bois' books Atlanta too.
Yeah.
Too. It's very, it's fascinating.
Tuskegee, Slungy, which is a prep school that Dubé started in Durban, and Tuskegee was started on the Tuskegee principles with George Washington Carver and Booker T. Washington. So there has been a closeness with South Africa and with Africa and African Americans.
And you've also worked with Nelson Mandela. Do you know him as well as you know New King, or do you?
Now his wife, Winnie Mandela, I was much closer to Miss Winnie Mandela than I was to Nelson Mandela. In 1992, Winnie came to Atlanta and was the Grand Marshal in the Martin Luther King March. And I took her on a 6-city tour in the U.S. I took her from Atlanta to Jacksonville, Florida, to Gainesville, Florida, to New Orleans, Louisiana, to Houston, Texas, Dallas, Texas, and Los Angeles. And we bonded. And the ANC Women's League that she represented at the time, we got to be close and we communicated and still communicate. When I went over for the Racism Conference in 2001, just before 9/11, I sat with Winnie Mandela and with Jacob Zuma in Spoo in the Delhi in the Racism Conference on the gallery floor was their guest. I co-led the delegation with the Black Leadership Forum and Dr. Yvonne Scruggs-Lethbridge, who is the director. That Dr. Lowry was the director, was the president at the time, but I co-led the delegation. And our Black Caucus sent 7 Black Congress people. Cynthia McKinney did one. The only male that showed was Congressman John Conyers from Michigan, but Barbara Lee, Sheila Jackson Lee, Maxine Waters, Diane Watson, and there was one other one, and Cynthia McKinney. That made up the delegation with John Conyers. And George Bush basically, when they left coming back, because that was a big vote that was to take place around Afghanistan, and they basically left, and when they left, he put out the word that he had ordered them back. He didn't order them back off, he didn't order them over there. But what happened since that time, that Cynthia McKinney made her announcement, Earl Hillier made his announcement, and both of those two Congress people lost because of positions that they took with the continent of Africa and with the Middle East. I think the bad thing is nobody is thinking about the lives that have lost in Afghanistan, from Afghanistanians and from Americans, in Iraq, from Iraq, U.S. folk. And I think more Americans have been killed since Bush called the war off. So it's something to wrong, and I think the international ties that we have to be looked at. Here, George Bush last week make a trip to South Africa and make a trip to West Africa and East Africa and Central Africa, but he didn't talk to the Black Caucus before he left. What does he think? Now the Africans in the continent looked up to Martin Luther King, and they saw a good picture when they saw Martin Luther King and saw Jesse Jackson, but during this Iraq war, they saw the Condoleezza Rices and the Colin Powers, and so they don't have the same face of African Americans that they see, or that they've seen for the past 25 to 50 years. But the faces that they see now brings greed and violence. It's not that loving feeling. But when he got in trouble, those African Americans were the ones who had to go and explain him out of the trouble. The Condoleezza Rice, it wasn't Cheney talking about the mistake of it, the quote that was left out. You know, it wasn't J.L. Bush. It was Condoleezza Rice and Cola Bauer. So they still gonna have to be there to bail them out.
The other thing, it's kind of an international situation. I wanted to talk to you about the Olympics here, the organizing effort that went on in the Olympics. It had sort of an international component, but also the unions had a lot of success organizing these Olympics and getting a lot of the work unionized.
Because we was on the ground, and Shirley Franklin, Andy Young, Amy Jackson, they were intricately involved in putting together the Olympics coming here. Andy had lobbied some of the members of the International Olympic Committee about Atlanta before it got here. When the building trades and those unions that saw the Olympics coming in 5-6 years beforehand, we had already undergirded ourselves in the community with those groups and those NPUs that the Olympics would have been effective. And I think Stuart Oakhurst saw my involvement, and he used it, and he used it to the highest. When the need came to have the protesting done, to make sure that certain language was in the contracts that took place, we was in position to get on the telephone with Andy Young. I go by his house at 2-3 o'clock in the morning and sit around and talk about what to do. He would talk about strategies that we needed to do to make sure that if you're gonna have a protest, don't just come down there with 2 or 3 folk, come down there with a large number. And a lot of the strategies was planned prior